Hello, I'm Ismarie Pavon, a YA book reviewer and a program coordinator. Welcome to Miami Book Fair 2021, taking place online and in downtown Miami on the Wolfson campus of Miami-Dade College, our home since 1984. Miami-Dade College's commitment to access for all has guided our vision of an inclusive, attentive, sustainable community of writers, readers, and collaborators across all disciplines and cultures in South Florida. I'm Miami connected to the world, and a world connected to Miami through a vibrant, accessible exchange of ideas. And so we welcome all of you on behalf of our college president, Madeline Pumariega, the MDC Board of Trustees, and the staff, advisors, and supporters of the Miami Book Fair. We wish you the very best and hope you enjoyed this program and all others representing this fair. I am thrilled to introduce the panelists and three writers on history, hardships, and healing, moderated by Harmony Birch and Maggie Collins from Rebel Girls Book Club. Ruth Behar was born in Havana, Cuba, and grew up in New York. A cultural anthropologist and an author, she has lived in Spain and Mexico and returns often to Cuba to build bridges around culture and art. Behar won the Puma Pelbray Author Medal for her debut middle grade novel, Lucky Broken Girl. Her recent novel, Letters from Cuba, Cartas de Cuba, is a Sidney Taylor notable book. Her debut picture book, Tia Fortuna's New Home, set in Miami, is forthcoming in 2022. Behar is the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant and was named a Great Immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. She teaches anthropology at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. Saadia Faruqi is a Pakistani-American writer, interfaith activist, and a cultural sensitivity trainer. She is the author of the children's early reader series, Jasmine, the middle grade novel, 1,000 Questions, and the co-author of the middle grade novel, A Place at the Table. She was profiled in O Magazine as a woman making a difference in her community and serves as an editor-in-chief of Blue Minaret, a magazine for Muslim art, poetry, and prose. She resides in Houston, Texas with her family. Jasmine Morga is also the author of the New York Times bestseller, Other Words for Home, a Newbery Honor book and a Walter Honor book for young readers. Her teen books, Here We Are Now, and My Heart and Other Black Holes, have been translated into over 25 languages. She lives in Chicago area with her family. Enjoy.
So I guess that we'll just start by asking you to please introduce your books. Jasmine, would you mind introducing The Shape of Thunder for us?
No, I'm happy to do that. I'll grab a copy so I can hold up the cover while I talk. So The Shape of Thunder is my most recent novel for middle graders, and it is about two girls whose friendship has been fractured due to a tragedy that's happened in their small Ohio town. A school shooting happened at the high school, and while Cora and Quinn, the two main characters, are both in middle school, they are grappling in different ways with the ramifications of this tragedy and violence. And the book is about their path back to one another. And it's really about this question of how do we live with the impossible? How do we change the impossible? And what power is there in imagination? And how can imagination help us to heal?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Ruth, would you mind going next?
No, I'd be happy to. Hi, Ruth Behar, and I'll be introducing my book, Letters from Cuba. This is my new middle grade novel, and happy to say that it's also in Spanish as Cartas de Cuba. And so this book is inspired by the story of my maternal grandmother, who was named Esther, and she was the first in her family of 7 children to migrate to Cuba by herself to meet up with her father, who was already there from Poland. And this is the true part of the story. She begged him to let her be the first of the children to go to Cuba. He wanted to bring one of the sons, and she said, "No, I'm the eldest of all the children, and I should be allowed to go. And I promise to help you bring everybody to Cuba." And in real life, her father, my great-grandfather, agreed. And that's the inspiration for the story. It's about a young girl, 11 going on 12, who gets to Cuba, finds her father, and works really hard and meets all of these interesting people in Cuba in the process and helps to bring her family to Cuba on the eve of World War II.
Thank you so much. And then Saadia, last but not least, would you mind introducing Yusuf Azeem is Not a Hero?
Sure. This is my new book, Yusuf Azeem is Not a Hero. This is a story of a sweet, nerdy 11-year-old boy, Muslim American, first-generation kid living in a small Texas town. The town is getting ready to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and Yusuf notices a lot of unrest in terms of just some people being extremely hateful towards his family and friends and people that he knows. And he starts reading a journal that his uncle gave him from 20 years ago when his uncle was his age during the 9/11 attacks, to try to understand his townspeople better, to try to understand what he can do to manage some of not only the bullying in school, but also how adults are treating each other, which gets worse and worse in a very dangerous way. And as he reads, and as my readers read the journal entries, parts of the book, they get a better understanding of how, even though 20 years have passed, a lot of things, especially for the Muslim American community, for the Arab American community, and for anybody who's seen as an outsider, have not really changed and have in fact become worse in the last 20 years as a result of prejudice after 9/11. So hopefully kids who were not alive during this time can get a better sense of what it was like. So it's not really historical, but it goes back and forth in time a lot.
That leads us really well into our first theme, which is history. And I have a group question for you all. We'll start with Jasmine. The question is, how do people and characters cope with the idea of living through history or unprecedented times?
Yeah, so that's a beautiful question. I think that when it comes to when I'm writing for young people, I'm always thinking about this idea of our young people are creating a future by living in the present, the way that they're choosing to conduct their lives, the ways that they're choosing what to care about and who to be and how to take care of one another is what is shaping the future. And I think that all of us who write for young people also recognize that, and that for me, the books that and what matters. And so I think about that a lot when I'm crafting a book, wanting to show that there's heroes come in all different forms, which isn't something I necessarily saw as a kid. But more to get to the idea of characters, I think that when you ask, how do they make sense of living through an unprecedented time? I think it's often hard to understand when you're in that moment that it is an unprecedented time. And so I always try to be as authentic as possible to what the experience would be like for that character then. Similar to what Saadia was just discussing with 9/11, I remember being in 8th grade when 9/11 happened and my teacher telling me, you're going to remember this moment for the rest of your life. And me thinking what? Yeah, right. And now I do. And I'm only able to see it though, because of everything else that came after and understand it and contextualize it. So I think that when you're writing a book, it depends a lot on where that character is in relation to that event, how they're going to process it, and being really careful not to project an understanding onto it that would be beyond what it feels like in its immediate feeling. I just think about how I processed March 2020. If I were to write about it in March 2020, is very different than how I would write about it even today with that space. So I think it's all about honoring that time frame. Ruth, do you like that?
Yeah, no, I love what you said. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think history is very much a retrospective process. We're living through history, but we don't know exactly what we're living through until it's past, essentially, because in the moment it's unfolding, right? And so it's very hard to know. You just know that you're living through something difficult or through changes, or that you have to make a move to help your family. I mean, so you have kind of these pressures on you in the sense that things are changing, but you don't necessarily know what it's all going to mean till afterwards. And so history is always kind of a process of looking back. And that's what makes historical fiction, so interesting, that we're all kind of engaging in this process of rethinking whether it's the very recent past or a much further past, as in the case of my book, which is looking back at the 1930s. But I think one of the amazing things that we do as authors is that we help people to think about the past and the present and how they intersect and how they're totally in relationship to each other. The past is never something that just happened. It has an effect on people in the present, right? It's like threads that connect us. It's like a tapestry, and the threads of the past connect us to what's going on in the present. And so as authors, we can also help people to understand what happened, to understand the effects that it had on different communities. And also we can rethink just what history means, who is writing history, who is being erased from history. And so we can, really fight back against erasures, right? And I think, that's what we're all doing in a way. I know that in writing Letters from Cuba, I wanted people to know about this Jewish immigration to Cuba in the 20s and 30s, because we mostly think of Jewish immigration to the United States, or we mostly think of immigration in terms of people coming to the US, but other countries have also taken in immigrants. And in this period when Jews couldn't emigrate to the US, the door was closed. They had this terrible quota system and basically made it impossible for Jewish immigrants to come to the US in that period, right when things were getting really bad in Europe. The Holocaust hadn't happened yet, but it was like a pre-Holocaust, or kind of a pre-Shoah that was about to happen. And then Cuba opened its doors for its own racist reasons, because the Cuban government was concerned that the country was becoming too black, and they wanted more European immigrants to come to Cuba. And they thought of Jewish people as Europeans. They were from Poland, they were from Russia, they were from Turkey. So they accepted them. The same people that weren't accepted in the United States were accepted into Cuba. And so to me, it was important to bring that history, into consciousness and into visibility, because it's not a history that we know. And so I wanted my character, Esther, to really be kind of aware that, things are changing. She's not sure exactly what's going to happen. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. And so she's, fighting to bring her family to Cuba, because there's poverty, because there's anti-Jewish hatred in Poland. But that's basically all she knows. She doesn't know what all the ramifications are going to be. But nevertheless, she's acting, in terms of what she knows in that historical moment. Yeah, so Saadia, you want to continue?
I love what both of you said. Kind of, reminds me of this quote that's in my book. Uncle Rahman, who's one of the secondary characters in this book, Yusuf's uncle, says, "History informs the present, and so it affects the future." And oftentimes when we as people, or our characters often are more self-aware than we are, because, we want them to be as such. But generally, human beings don't really place emphasis on how, when we're going through something, it's something huge. But the two events that I kind of talk about in my book, Yusuf Azeem is not a hero, are so big. Well, 9/11, definitely the characters going through this time, this event, this year or a few months, definitely know that they are going through something very significant and historical and very realistically even dangerous. But even the other parts of the book, the main story of the book, which is set in current times, it is very, very current. It's literally set in, right now, a month or so before today. So there is very much mention of the pandemic, which I know that a lot of COVID-19, there are a lot of authors, most authors have not really, have been keeping away from that in their books, with just not sure, because we're going through such an important time. How do you write about it? When will it end? When will kids want to read about this? But I was kind of stuck in a situation where I had to, because in order to make this book really realistic. And that the way I did that was by looking at myself and my family and people I knew, and the fact that I have a high schooler and a middle schooler, and I was talking to my kids constantly since the day of that we first knew about this pandemic, that talking to them about how this was something historical, how this was something that we were kind of living through a time that would be written about in history books and our place in it. And oftentimes adults don't like to even think about that, let alone explain to their kids about it. But I'm not that kind of person, so I do that anyway with my children. And that helped me a lot when I was writing this book, to kind of place these characters in these situations, both in the current times and in the journal entries 20 years ago, where you kind of are able to see through their eyes, that they realize that they're living through history. Whether they deal with it in an appropriate way or not is different. But having that added burden of not just being a kid in middle school who's going through some stuff, but a kid in middle school who's going through some stuff while the world is also going through a pandemic, the likes of which we've never seen before, or a kid in middle school who's now being targeted the way that millions of people like him are targeted, with prejudice and hatred because of something they were not connected to. Those are the kind of difficult things that we as authors like to fling at their characters to see how they'll react. And I love that part of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all so much for those answers. They were so nuanced and they really gave me so much insight onto all three of your books. Ruth, starting with you, I would say one of the things that I really loved about Letters from Cuba was how strong Esther's narrative voice was. She felt simultaneously like she was really grounded in her historical moment, but also like she could have been a 12-year-old for our contemporary time. And I know her story was inspired by your grandmother as well. How do you think about crafting a main character that can really immerse readers in a really important part of history, but also give young readers especially a voice that they can identify with and relate to now?
Yeah, I probably don't even know how to answer that question. I think a lot of my writing is intuitive, but I'm sure there's a lot of craft involved as well. But I think what helped me a lot with Letters from Cuba was deciding to write it as letters. I think that was crucial because then it could really be Esther's voice speaking, and that the letters are directed to her sister. So she loves her younger sister, Malka. Malka's in Poland, and she's always been the defender of her younger sister. The other siblings are boys, or three boys, so it's always been the two sisters and the three brothers. So she loves her younger sister, but her younger sister has stayed behind in Poland. And so the letters are directed to Malka. She's not mailing the letters, but she's collecting these letters with the hope that once she's done writing them, Malka will appear in Cuba. So the letters have this kind of magical pull for Esther because she's writing them for Malka with the hope that Malka will arrive in Cuba and they'll be able to read the letters together. So there's this magic to the writing as Esther sees it, because the letters are going to pull Malka to Cuba. So that helped a lot to just have that sort of framework in my mind. And then the other part of it was that writing in that strong first person of a letter also helped me to give her a really powerful voice because she's directing all of these thoughts to her sister. She wants to show her sister like everything that she's learning in Cuba, all the cultures that she's learning about, the different religions that she's learning about, Afro-Cuban and Chinese-Cuban, religion and culture, and how she's inserting herself into this world, how she's sharing her Jewish culture with these strangers that she's meeting in the countryside in Cuba. So all of that, I think, helps to create the strong voice that we're talking about, the resilient voice. I think she's very determined. And I was thinking of so many kids trying to cross the Mexico-US border, so many kids migrating by themselves in this era in the last few years, and how powerful that is, and how so many of them are just trying to come over either to reunite with family who are here in the US or to help their family back in Latin America. And so I was thinking about that and what strength it must take for a young person to do that, to come across the border. And as I thought about that, I thought, well, that's what my grandmother did, back in a different era, coming across the ocean all by herself on a boat and arriving in Cuba, not knowing how she was going to find her father. So I thought about basically the courage of kids. And, you see that so much in young people, the tremendous courage that they have, the sense of responsibility that they have to their families. They really want to help. There's a kind of just tremendous purity and love, I feel, especially in kids of that age, in the middle grade age. And so I just wanted to give all of those characteristics to Esther to really make her someone who cares cares a lot, who really cares. But at the same time, she's a young person, so she's also learning like tunes to jump rope with, in Cuba, because she doesn't know those tunes, of course, coming from Poland. So she's also being a kid and kind of enjoying life as a child does at the age of 11 or 12. But she also has this responsibility and this weight on her, which is, how am I going to help my father? Because her father is a peddler and not very good at it. He's a very religious man and really isn't good at selling anything. And that's why it's been so hard for him to bring the family over. And so it becomes, Esther's sense of responsibility to really help her father to bring the family. So there's that. And then there's the fact that I wanted her to have a skill. And I think all kids have like a magic skill, a special skill that they can use to help themselves and to help others. And in Esther's case, it's sewing, which was kind of true in my family. Like the women in my family all knew how to sew and make dresses and so on. And so I decided to give that kind of superpower to Esther. And that's how she's going to help bring her family over.
Thank you for that, Ruth. I really loved how you connected Esther's history to current events. That kind of leads me to my next question, which is for Jasmine. So this book focuses on recent and personal histories in terms of the friendship and losses for both Quinn and Cora. And they're both in the process of grieving. The United States right now is dealing with an epidemic of gun violence, and school shootings is a large, most visible symptom of that. And it's been most visible since Columbine in 1999. So I was wondering why it's important for you to highlight an epidemic that we as a nation are still struggling with, while also placing the incident featured in this book only a year out.
Yeah, so what I really wanted to do was write a book that kind of honored and was honest about the world that our kids are living in today and what it means to be a kid today and what it means to live under this constant threat of violence and trauma. And our kids are carrying so much trauma. I initially got the idea for the book from being troubled by the fact that really soon I was going to have to talk to my daughter, who would be going into kindergarten, about having an active shooter drill, having a lockdown drill. And I had this moment of, how do we get here as a country? How do we decide that the solution to this problem was to push responsibility onto our kids to learn how to duck and cover or run, as opposed to trying to fix the issue in a more systematic and comprehensive way? And so I was thinking a lot about responsibility, the responsibility our kids hold. But it wasn't until at the time I was doing school visits for my other book, Other Words for Home, and I was doing a lot of school visits. And from these school visits, I realized how so many of our schools, almost all of the schools I visited, were designed around the idea that this threat could happen, that there was a constant reminder of it, about how you check in, how you go through all these different locked doors, how everything is shut down. And I started to have conversation with students and realized how hungry they were to talk about this issue, and how, because it makes so many of us uncomfortable and is so upsetting, I feel like we've created silence around it. But silence isn't how we change things. And I really believe in books as conversation starters and vehicles to create like discussion. And I think in discussion, we can hopefully advance the conversation forward and come up with ideas so that we don't all become sort of complacent with the status quo, because it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that sometimes when we're quiet about it and just accept it and just let lockdown drills become so normalized, we forget that there could be a better way. And as a writer, I don't have the ideas, the solutions. I guess that's has been one of the most difficult things about writing this book, is that I think it's a book that's more interested in questions as opposed to answers. I'm more interested in having a conversation with young people and letting them talk about, like I said, what it's like to be an 11 or 12-year-old today. I think I saw this topic covered more in books for older kids because statistically, the violence often happens at high schools more frequently than middle schools. But the way this violence affects communities and affects everyone in the community means that it's not just, isolated to our teenagers. And so I wanted our I wanted my young readers that I saw who were living this issue, who are affected by this issue, who are really having, like I said, a lot of fear and trauma associated around it, to have a platform to be able to begin discussion about, like I said, like what it means to be a kid and what it means to live with this constant threat of violence. And then as for why the timeline is the way that it is, I was thinking a lot about the appropriateness of this age group. The last thing I wanted to do was write a book that sensationalized violence, that would frighten kids. It was more about wanting to write a book that was about healing, that was about ideas, that was about how do we live in a better way? How do we create communities that aren't, constantly under threat of this kind of violence, and how do we look at that? And so for me, placing it a year out gave us some space. It didn't center the book around the act of violence, but more around this idea of grief and healing and the sort of the survivors of the violence, as opposed to making the emphasis on the actual event itself, which I think so often happens in our media coverage, that we become hyper fixated on the perpetrator of the act. We become hyper fixated on that community for the 5 minutes that they have the camera shoved in the faces of the people who've been highly traumatized, but we don't think about what it means to live in that community 2 years after the fact, 5 years after the fact, how this is a loss and this is a trauma that's going to live in that community for years. And so I kind of wanted to center the book in that place too, so that it was a book that was asking questions about how do we heal, how do we move forward, how do we change this, and not just questions about that specific act of violence.
Thanks, Jasmine. That was really beautiful. I especially picked up on the themes that you were talking about community trauma and community grief. I feel like all three of these books center so much around community as part of healing. But Saadia, and Yusuf Azeem is not a hero. We see community come out as well. Yusuf really goes on a journey where he learns throughout the story why history, especially recent history, community history, matters and sticks with us in the present. At the beginning, he's really actively wondering about why 9/11, an event that occurred 20 years ago, would still be so present in the consciousness of the adults around him. And by the end, he's got this really powerful exchange with his uncle where he understands that sometimes the past can feel like an open wound for those who lived through it. And I was wondering, why was it important for you that Yusuf start the novel in a place where he was questioning and kind of still learning about how recent history influenced the present, rather than being a little further down on that journey like some of his friends and other students?
Yusuf is very much an embodiment of the average middle school 6th or 7th grader today. I've been thinking about writing a story about 9/11 since 9/11 happened. 20 years ago, I was not really a good writer at all. I was just dabbling, so I knew it wasn't the right time. But I always knew I wanted to write a story about this event. And over the years, as I was in college when the attacks happened, but as I grew older and then I became a mom and had kids of my own, first generation Muslim American kids, facing a lot of the same prejudice that I faced and people I knew faced 20 years ago. The idea of what I wanted the story to be and what I wanted to say through these characters morphed quite a bit in the last, many years as I was thinking and planning and yearning to write the story, but not really. It's a very difficult thing to write about, especially when you and your family and friends and everyone you know and your community at large throughout the world goes through things that other people either try to minimize or don't even know about or don't want to talk about. So I decided that when I actually got down to writing the story, I decided that I would write it from the perspective of any kid like my son or my daughter or Yusuf, who knows what's going on in a very general sense, have heard about 9/11, don't really care much about it because it's ancient history, as most kids that age will look at anything that was, in the 1900s or the 2000s or anything like that. But also facing a lot of the repercussions that came about as a result of 9/11 in our government, in our culture, in our politics, in how people treat each other. So not knowing how those two are connected. That's very normal for most, unless you're very self-aware or you have, like an activist parent, like my kids probably know a little bit more than the general sense. And so Yusuf is this kid who he just wants to be in the robotics competition. He wants to make his school and his family proud. He is not interested in what's going on around him, in the sense that, that's not his life. And then these things start snowballing where there's a group of white nationalists in his town that are really being more and more increasingly hurtful, offensive, even kind of dangerous to his family and friends. And people keep saying, never forget. And he doesn't understand why something that happened 20 years ago is affecting him. And so the reason I started from that point is because it's the point that most of my readers start with. And I wanted them to know that it was okay to start from that. You can't always be knowing things that happened 20 years ago or knowing the significance of it, especially when adults also often don't know. The average adult who doesn't have a lot of, who's not a person of color or a Muslim or an immigrant themselves, or doesn't have somebody in their lives like that, they can go through their entire lives not knowing about the repercussions of 9/11 to communities of color, to Muslim American communities, and so how can we expect an 11-year-old kid to know that? And that was the main reason why I said, well, this is what it is. And this is how Yusuf starts, because, majority of my readers start at this space, at this point in time, and then go from there. The story has two really very different plots almost. There's the journal entries which describe what 9/11 was like for a kid who's a Muslim kid going through things and watching his parents being treated badly, and watching what's happening in the news and what the president at that time is saying and how they're going off to wars and they're worried. But then there's also the current timeline, which is really what I wanted kids to understand and adults to understand, that things that happened 20 years ago, they're not over. There's still, like Jasmine said, there's things that happen, 10, 15, 20 years later that we don't cover in the news or we don't talk about unless you're in that group. So in the story, there's Yusuf's community is building a mosque, and some people in his town are actively trying to stop it from being built. So protests and, ugly letters and going to city council and trying to block it. And so things like that, which we don't really think about as related to 9/11, but they really are. Those are the kind of things that I wanted Yusuf to understand, because he didn't understand that, and my readers to understand. So I think that's just presenting everything in a platter and hoping that the readers will kind of understand and absorb on their own pace, just like Yusuf does. And as every scene that goes on, and Yusuf, and so the readers have this better, oh, okay, this happened. Wow, this is connected to what I read in the journal. Oh, okay, this happened. And my uncle went through something very similar 20 years ago. How is this happening? What is going on? So that's how we learn. And, I think that's very natural.
Thank you, Saadia. Your description of open wounds and Yusuf's path towards understanding leads very well to our next question, which is about hardship. So all of these novels felt like positive examples for how to cope with hardship. And I wanted to know what your individual philosophies for telling stories of hardship for children are. And let's start with Ruth this time, and then move on to Saadia, and then we'll have Jasmine's answer.
Thank you for that question. It's really interesting about hardship. I'm just going to mention that in my previous novel, Lucky Broken Girl, which I view as kind of a complement to this one, Letters from Cuba, it's totally about hardship. It's about a girl who's recently arrived from Cuba, ends up in a terrible car accident with her family, and is in a body cast for a year and has to just stay in bed, and how miserable she is, and how does she get through that time? Well, she gets through it with very wonderful community, her family, neighbors, friends, but also reading books and also doing art and imagination and listening to people's stories. So I kind of started thinking about hardship writing that story that takes place in the 60s and is based on my life. And then from there, in writing Letters from Cuba, I was thinking about a different kind of hardship, which is the hardship of, again, being separated from your family or choosing to be separated from your family in order to help your family, which is kind of a very strange thing, but so many people have had to do that. And so that kind of hardship, the hardship that the immigrant faces, especially a young immigrant in this case, and thinking about things again like poverty and hunger and racial hatred and how that affects individuals and communities. So with Esther, she goes through the hardship of dealing with all of these things and prepared to really make any kind of sacrifice that she needs to make to help her family when she arrives and her father tells her, well, there were many days when all I had to eat was water and sugar, but, there's a lot of sugar in Cuba, and that's what I was living on. And she says, well, Papa, if I need to do that too, I will. And so there's that moment where she just recognizes the sacrifice that her father has made to bring her to Cuba, and that she's ready to make a similar sacrifice if needed to help her family. So I think hardship is something that everybody goes through. I think we've been hearing that from all of the presentations today. Different kinds of hardship. There's just the hardship of being hated simply for who you are, for your ethnicity, for your religion, for how you look, for racial and class background, and so on. That's a hardship in itself that makes it very, very difficult for a young person to grow up. That's a kind of, everyday trauma that has to be faced. And so that's a really, really terrible hardship. And Esther, to some extent, is expecting to live through that kind of hardship in Cuba because she's been so othered in Poland. She's so used to being viewed as an other, as a Jew in Poland. But then she arrives in Cuba and finds that she's not hated in that way, that there's a different kind of spirit in Cuba, and that there's a lot of tolerance, actually, that she wasn't expecting. But on the other hand, it's not as if anti-Semitism doesn't exist in Cuba, because the owner of the sugar plantations, Senor Eduardo is a horrible anti-Semite and anti-immigrant and very xenophobic person in Cuba. And there were people of that nature in Cuba at that time. So she still has to face that hardship. But as you mentioned before, community is so important. And what helps her to get through the hardships that she's facing is the support of the community in the countryside, that she meets people that want to help her and that want to support her, and that don't mind at all the fact that she's different, that she has a different faith, and that she has a different culture, and that she brings a different language to Cuba. And so this tolerance helps her get through hardship. And I think that, for me, is a very important part of how I wanted to tell the story. In my other life, I'm also a cultural anthropologist. So I'm always thinking about communities and cultures and how having culture and heritage behind us is a way to get through sometimes through the worst kind of hardship.
Saadia, can you give us your philosophy about writing about hardship for children?
Yeah, that's hard. I don't mind it. Even as a mom, I'm, the first one, whenever something happens in the news or personally in our lives, I'm the first one to sit my kids down and explain things. Even when they were little, they're older now, but I've never shied away from talking to kids about hardship, and that's why I feel that they deserve it. And the more kids understand about the world, they're better able to kind of handle things and not be like some of the clueless adults I've seen in my life, which I really find is more dangerous than anything else, not knowing what things are and how they work and how they affect other people. So I do the same thing with my readers. All my middle grade novels have some ugly things in them because that's how reality is. I think that for me, the key is not shying away, especially in Yusuf Azeem. It gets progressively worse, and things happen that shouldn't happen to any kid or any adult. but I feel that if that's reality and if people are going through it, then what right do I have to not include that in a story about this topic or about any topic that I'm writing about? Because that would be very disingenuous of me. I wouldn't be doing my duty as an author, as a storyteller, if I shied away and just put in things that were just, mediocre, just kind of not actually going there and showcasing all the hurt and the challenges and the difficult situations. So it's never been a case of, oh, should I do it or not? It's only been a case of how do I make sure that it's not, overly traumatic for kids to read, but they still understand how serious it is, and then they can talk about it and discuss it. So I've generally done that only through, just comic relief. Whenever there's a scene in the book that's difficult to read or process for a reader, and for me to write, there's always one or two characters that are kind of making jokes about it, or or being nice about it or kind about it in a way that all those are ways that I think readers can also pick up how to deal with things, because it's not just reading what's happening. It's for a reader at any age. It's also about how understanding or analyzing how they could react in such a situation, right? A lot of my writing is about, here's a situation that you might find yourself in, or your friend might find yourself in. Do you just stand by and do nothing, or do you help out? Do you stand up for that person? Do you do anything? Do you be an ally? And so it's not just presenting that scene as it happens, but also kind of giving through the characters and their actions some clues as to how a reader could deal with a similar situation in real life. So whether it's through a joke, for example, there's a scene in the book, in the early part of the book, where they're talking about this big graffiti sign that's come up overnight outside the school saying "Never Forget," and then the kids are all talking about it, and a couple kids in the hallways and the class call Yusuf and his friend terrorist, which, by the way, is very common even today, 20 years from now, for Muslim kids, especially boys, to be called this in school. And I put that, I was actually worried that, we in our house, we call it the T word, because, it's just something that's the worst thing you can say to a kid, in my family, at least. But I said, I'm going to put it in because I know kids go through it and I know they hear it. And but then we also had immediately another character say, well, how old do you think Yusuf is? 50 years old? He couldn't have been a terrorist on 9/11. So just even if it's a little silly thing like that, or it's other characters showing how they can help out, how they can be kind, how can they be generous, and showing through the actions in the book. Hopefully that's a way to balance out a lot of the hardship, but also make it be known that as a reader, as a person in real life, if you see something like that happen, do not just, do nothing, because that's how these things continue for years and years and decades, and nothing happens because we're all quiet about it.
Jasmine, can you share your philosophy with us?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot, and I've loved everything that I've heard. So I guess I take a similar approach. But for me, it's about thinking about this intersection between honesty and hope. I think that it's so important to be honest with young readers. Our kids are living through really, really difficult times. They know that they're living through really difficult times. And I think that if we obfuscate around that, if we don't talk about it honestly, what happens is it just leads to more confusion and fear, because it's not as if they don't realize these things are happening. It's not as if they don't share these things at school, or that, the world is an imperfect place and our kids know how difficult it is. And I think they're looking to books and other media to help them make sense of what they're seeing in terms of inequities and hardships and unkind things. And so for me, I always think about, how the Trevor Project, I like their slogan of "It Gets Better." But for me, when I'm writing my books, I think the message I want kids to take away is not necessarily it gets better, but you get better and you have the ability to make it better. So I think that it's like, I like to meet them where the world is, but also hopefully by the time they close my book, not that they feel flattened by the honesty of the book or feel flattened by the hardships that the characters have gone through, but feel empowered that they can make the world a better place and that their voice matters and that there's ways that we can all contribute to hopefully making the world just a tiny bit better. And so I think that it is that balance between, I never want to write a book that leaves a reader feeling completely like distraught about the world. I think a lot back on my experience of reading Bridget Terabitha as a kid. And I loved that book. That book made me cry. That book devastated me. But that book was also honest with me. And because it was honest with me about mortality, about kind of sometimes the senselessness of tragedy, it made me feel empowered, like it saw me and was willing to be honest with me. And then I could help process some of these difficult things about the world. And so I think that's always what I'm going for, is that intersection of honesty and hope, that I want my readers to have hope. I want the book to be infused with a certain type of love and gentleness for younger readers, while also asking really incisive and really difficult questions, because I think our kids not only can handle it, but that they deserve that.
Thank you. All of your answers were beautiful. We're going to move on to individual questions now. And my first question is for Jasmine. One of the central plots in your book is the rift between Cora and Quinn. And there are so many hardships that are depicted in The Shape of Thunder related to grief and school shootings, which might not be universally relatable to your average reader. Dealing with the rift between a friend, however, is a common experience. And I would like to know why you chose to focus on the grief associated with losing one's best friend, and why does a difficult friendship play such a central role in your story?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about how in coming of age, sometimes we all have had that experience of feeling like we're becoming a different person from our friend, and how do you navigate that? And I think that is kind of a central coming of age experience, but also the value in that friend that you've had your whole life, that I think sometimes our society pressures us to make friends that are like us, right? There's like something in our school system or the way that it works or just in what we become comfortable with. And I think that the beauty of friends, if we can maintain them through all of those bumps and ups and downs, of staying friends with that person who, because their last name was the same as yours in kindergarten, you sat next to one another. Or in the case of Cora and Quinn, because your houses were next door on the street, and so that was an easy playmate to play with in the yard. There's something valuable, right, about the way those people reflect different parts of ourselves back to us. So if all of the friends in your friend group have the same similar interests, and you're all, tagged in the way Cora is in her gifted and talented program, there's a different version of herself there than the version she is with Quinn. And I think the book in some ways is about celebrating the fact that we all contain like multitudes, and our friends can help us like tease that out about us, whether or not we like that. And I think that was something that was really difficult for me in middle school, is understanding that I didn't have to be one kind of kid. I could be lots of different things. And I think that that's sort of how friendship is. And I also wanted to show the insecurity that's inherent in friendship. I think in middle school it can be really difficult. So Quinn constantly feels like she's the not smart friend, right? Because the way our traditional school system works rewards learners like Cora, who are fast processors, who find it really easy to memorize information and repeat it back in like a very fast way. Whereas Quinn has a much dreamier mind, and her mind doesn't work that well, and she finds it difficult to sit, and she finds it difficult to process information like that. And because of that, kind of feels dumb. But when she's around Cora, weirdly, I think when they're in that traditional setting, she feels that with Cora. But when she's around Cora, because of the way their friendship operates, she feels like she's bringing something to the table, and that she's smart, and that she has creative ideas, and that she's imaginative. So I also wanted to show that dynamic, that like friendships can help us to like see each other more clearly than the way we sometimes get sorted by the traditional school system, or get sorted kind of in the way I think school kind of like, the leveled reading groups or the leveled math groups, and the way that happens. So I was interested in exploring all of that, because again, I think that while the book centers on this tragedy that many readers thank goodness, may not have experienced. I wanted there to be universal elements of coming of age. And to me, like, friendship was that central thing in my life when I was a middle grader, of, like, again, figuring out myself by figuring out who I was in relation to these other people in my life who really mattered.
Thank you so much for that. I love the idea of friendship being able to show you different sides of yourself and a tool for self-reflection as well. Saadia, Yusuf Azeem is Not a Hero also focuses so heavily on friendship. And one thing that I thought you did so wonderfully in the book was validating everybody's reactions to the violence and traumas that they were experiencing in school, whether they be comparatively maybe felt big or small. I don't think that there's any such thing as small violences, but what I really loved about Yusuf was that when he saw something wrong happening, he never backed down. So I wanted to dig deeper into your answer to know what inspired Yusuf's default reaction to hate to often be direct action, and why it's so valuable for kids and adult readers to read from the perspective of a character who, when is moved to action in ways that are big and small. And by the end of the novel also inspires his friends to act in the same way.
Yeah, not only his friends, but his entire community, adults as well. This is how I am, and this is what I feel really passionate about. So I came to this country as an immigrant when I was 22 years old, and then I was in college, and 2-3 years later, 9/11 happened, and my whole world changed, as everybody's did. But as being part of the Muslim American community, seeing the instinctive, lashing out of not just people in government, but also just your next door neighbor and when people you were studying with or working with. I didn't want to just watch and hide myself, although that instinct was also very much there of pretending like I had no part of this and I didn't know what was going on. But I wanted to be a part of the solution, and I became an interfaith activist. So literally the day after 9/11, this is what I started doing with very small steps, but I've been doing it for the last 20 years, whether it's inviting people to my mosque or having an interfaith dinner or a breakfast or starting a book club. There's one book club in my community that I started with a friend who's a librarian, and it's now been going on for 10, 11 years. Events with speakers, training. I trained the entire police department. I just wanted to do things, and writing was a part of that. I started writing publicly and publishing my work as a way of talking to people about stereotyping and about sharing, things about my faith and my culture that are a little bit more accurate than what was in the media after 9/11. And so I never, and like Yusuf, a lot of what Yusuf goes through in terms of people telling him, just be quiet, sit down, this is dangerous, why are you doing this, don't be a hero, you can't change anything, you're one person against the entire world. I heard that time and again from not only just, people I didn't know, but my own family and my friends and people who didn't want me to put myself in danger. I went through some dangerous situations. I would go and, talk in front of a group, and I would have people cursing at me, and I would go back in my car and I would cry, and I would call my husband, and my husband would be like, why are you doing this? You shouldn't be doing this. You're so upset. And the only thing I could say was, no, I have to, because this is my way of trying to change something, and if I can change even one person's perspective, then it's worth it. And so obviously, my characters are going to be like that too. Yusuf is not going to just back down and sit and act like he can't do something, because an 11-year-old very much so is not going to be able to change in most situations, change how adults are thinking and doing, because most of what's happening is the adults who are like that, and but that doesn't stop him. I wanted all my readers to realize this, that they, even though they're kids, they have power, because being an ally is very powerful. Providing that allyship and that safe space and that kindness to another person who's going through something. And Yusuf himself goes through things, but that doesn't stop him either, because he realizes that he can show other people how to do something different and how to do something better. And you see by the end of the book, there is a lot of violence, like you said, yes, big and small, But it's also a book full of hope. It's a book that it has an embodiment of what kids and adults can do in their own little spheres. It doesn't have to be big action, which is what I learned through my interfaith work. I didn't go out and change the world, but if I did something that changed the mind of one person through my writing or my book club or my presentations or just, saying a friendly word to a neighbor, then it's worth it. And so it's such a, as you can tell, a big passion of mine. This is why I believe I can stand up on a soapbox and talk about this all day, because I want all my readers, whatever age they are, to know that to sit quietly and watch when injustice is happening. This is so wrong. And we have to just do whatever we can, maybe sometimes, hopefully not put ourselves in danger, but even if just take calculated risks and realize that maybe sometimes if I go out and say something, I'll be scared and something might happen, but also something might not happen and it might change someone's mind. So, of course, Yusuf will do that too.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that personal connection. That so resonates with me, the idea that if we stay in our comfort zones our whole lives, we're never going to grow and we're never going to change. And I feel like we really see every character in the novel really go through that experience. Ruth, I think that in some ways, Esther also kind of has a really similar experience of going outside of her comfort zone and being able to change other people's minds. Of course, she's also often navigating a multitude of traumas on a personal, community, and cultural scale. She feels so deeply the loss of being separated constantly from members of her family. And it's funny that you mentioned Esther having a superpower earlier, because I would say that if Esther had one superpower, it would be the ability to forge friendships and then be able to find comfort in the face of hardship in those friendships. And I really wanted to know why it was important to you to center friendship and cross-community friendship as one of the central themes in a novel about hardship, and also wanted to know what you think Esther would say makes a good friend.
Oh, thank you for that. That's so beautiful. And I've loved all the previous commentaries. They've been amazing. And I definitely connect with everything that's just been said about allyship and interfaith work and so on. It's very, very important to me. I think in part to just, again, bring in my personal background, I think having been a cultural anthropologist for most of my life and having lived with strangers and communities in Spain and Mexico and having gone back many, many times to Cuba where I was born, I'm always so grateful for all the people that took me in, had no idea where I was, who I was, and treated me with such tremendous kindness. So I think my whole life as an anthropologist in a way informs, the way I created the character of Esther as a stranger. She's a stranger coming into this community in the countryside of Cuba and Agramonte, a sugar growing area that had, many enslaved Africans working in the plantations. And that's where she ends up, because that's where her father takes her to live. And so I wanted to show that, I guess my main point was not to be afraid of difference. I think that's something that I've learned as an anthropologist and as a person, that we can coexist with one another, and that our differences are what make us human, and accepting these differences and sharing the differences, whether they're differences of culture, of faith, of heritage, of language, sharing all those things actually makes us more human in a way, allows us to coexist and to be more tolerant with each other. And so that was kind of my big, I guess the big point that I wanted to make, or the message in the book, without making that too heavy-handed, on the other hand. And because in truth, my family found refuge in Cuba, both sides of my family, the side from my mother's side that was Yiddish speaking, Polish, Russian background, and then my father's side that I'm writing about now, the Sephardic side that was from Turkey and lived in the Islamic world for 500 years after the expulsion from Spain. And so I'm really interested in how these Jewish people, found a home in Cuba, how they found refuge at a time when there weren't many other places to find refuge. And so because that theme is so important to me, I think I wanted to address it from the perspective of a young girl like Esther. And Esther, I wanted her to be a Jewish person who's not afraid of other faiths and other cultures. I wanted her to be a young person who can share her Jewishness, and this makes her, a little different from her father, who's a little concerned that, that she's like maybe sharing too much. She invites everybody over, her two friends that she meets in the town, Manuela, who's a granddaughter of a former slave, and Francisco Chang, who is a young Chinese immigrant who's come to Cuba to help his uncle manage the store that he has, the grocery store that he has in Agramonte. And so with these two kids, they kind of come together and are just kind of aware of like all the loss and grief that they've inherited and that they've also themselves experienced, because Francisco has left all of his family back in China, just like Esther has left her family in Poland. And so there's that, incredible bond between the two of them. And he tells Esther, I cry at night and I don't feel that I'm strong enough. And then she confesses that she also cries at night sometimes, and there are tears left on her pillow. So they understand each other in terms of this loss and grief. And then Manuela also has suffered because her mother has died young, and she's being raised by her grandmother and her father. And so they're all kind of struggling in different ways. They have very, very different cultures and different religious backgrounds, but they find a connection because they're like so many young people. They believe in justice, and so they create an anti-Nazi society, which just seemed like something that kids would do, and bring the adults into it as well, bring the parents and the neighbors into this association. That just seemed like something kids would do. Kids are very aware of injustice, and I think they are empowered. They can find their power to change things, and so I wanted all of that to be present in the story, without, on the other hand, making it too rose-colored either. And so that there is the figure of Senor Eduardo, who owns the sugar plantation and who's, completely, a horrible person. And in fact, and then the kids not only rise up against the anti-Semitism at the time, but they also rise up against the terrible working conditions at the sugar plantation. And so they really help to focus on injustice in various kinds of ways. And they do that because they can cross all of these borders of religious and cultural identity, and find a way to really speak across those differences, and to find love and friendship across those differences. And I think it's really that ability, as you say, that Esther has to find friends and to not be afraid of those who are different, but rather to just see them as fellow human beings who have different religious practices, different ideas of the world, but they're all equally human. And I think that was something that I just really wanted to make very clear in the story.
Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. Ruth, your talk just now about friendship as sort of a call to action and differences as a way of building community brings me really well to our next question. We're going to be talking about healing. And let's start with Saadia for this question, but I would like to know, all three of your stories seem to emphasize the theme of community, which plays a central role in each main character's healing process. Do you think community is an integral part of healing? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? If a certain situation is traumatic on a community level, then the healing must also be community level. Otherwise, it's not going to work, because one person can hopefully try to heal themselves, but if everyone's hurting or everyone is part of committing that hurt, then it has to be a joint effort. With the topic of my book, Yusuf Azeem is Not a Hero, where in both timelines, 2001 and 2021, the problem or the hurt is the way that Muslim Americans are treated and have been treated for a long time, based on stereotyping, based on misinformation, based on lies and untruths and so many other things. That's something that happened on a community-wide level if we take, the entire country and even the world as that community. So when you try to fix it, it has to also be on a larger level than just individuals. So I truly do believe that this is something that, whatever Yusuf in the story goes through, or if any one of his friends or his parents, whatever was happening, it needed to be fixed or tried to be fixed through the lens of everybody working together. That's just a far superior way of healing anything in such a situation. So you see that, in terms of how the adults are also dealing with things in this book. It's when the community gets together and they decide that, they're not going to let this group of white supremacists have this power to hurt everybody and to go around, doing whatever they think is right. When the other people in the town get together and decide to stand up to these adult bullies, that's when that community healing actually happens. And they all take their cues from this one 11-year-old boy, Yusuf, who's been brave enough to, stand up to not just the bullies in his school, but also the bullies in the town square and say, what are you doing? This is not right. Why are you behaving like this? It might start from one person, but then unless everybody is working towards that healing, it's not really going to work as well. So that's how what I believe happens in real life or should happen, and I work on that when I do my work in community healing and interfaith and intercultural work. It's not just me going out and doing something, but I get people together, and I, whether it's a group of my neighbors or a group of my, people in the city or the town that I'm in. One person can't really make a change. People have to work together to make a change. And that's a very powerful lesson once you understand that. The changes that happen can be so amazing because you get that understanding that, okay, we're stronger together. It sounds very cliche, but it's so true.
Mm.
Jasmine, will you tell us how community relates in your book and whether you think it's an integral part of healing and why?
Yeah, it's always a balance, right? Because I think that I always want to be imparting the message to young people. And I think a lot of times my characters discover power in their own uniqueness and their own individuality and figuring out who they are just a little bit better. And in doing that, having more confidence in their voice. But I think that fuels into the idea of community, that I think we will all be stronger, better communities if we are full of people who feel more assured in what their gift is and what their voice is and wanting to share it and change the community and are invested in wanting to make things better. And so I think that part of what is happening for Cora and Quinn at the beginning of the book is their community is really fractured, and the adults in their lives aren't really listening to them, and their adults in their lives want to pretend like what happened didn't happen, or what happened is an outlier, and so it wouldn't possibly happen again, or that they don't have a responsibility to prevent what happened, that it's just a tragedy that was going to happen no matter what. And in kind of ceding this power and ceding this responsibility, there's this confusing vacuum that's created for Cora and Quinn, right, where they feel more individual responsibility. And so the book kind of moves towards them understanding that they don't have to hold the weight of this individual responsibility, while also at the same time being encouraged to figure out what little thing they can offer, what things they can do to help encourage everyone in the community to move forward. Because I really do believe in the ability that its community is that of people that all move forward and enact change, that no movement is one person, even though oftentimes a movement has a very charismatic or well-spoken leader or figurehead behind it. What really makes progress and changes is lots of people getting on board with their wide variety of opinions, their diversity of gifts and talents and voices. And so I think in my novels, I'm always navigating that, right? That we zero in on characters. So there's an individuality to it. And I'm interested in that individuality because I so want to impart to kids that who they are matters, and the fact that they are different from one another matters, and that's special, and they should treasure that and figure out those things about themselves. Well, also then, instead of just staying in their little hub of when they figure out what is around them, figuring out how to share that special gift that they have with the community to change it for the better. So I think that, I guess my answer is both of how I approach it and how I think about it is the helping my characters and hopefully young people through reading my characters to figure out kind of their voice and role of how then they can engage with the community. Because I do think healing has to happen as a society, as a community, if we're really going to change.
Thank you. What about you, Ruth?
Yeah, I mean, this has all been so beautiful. I think what I can add is that in the case of Esther and Letters from Cuba, she's part of two communities. And so she's very torn because she wants to fit into both. So she knows that there's a Jewish community in Cuba, not where she's living, because they're living off in the countryside where only she and her father are the only Jewish people. But in Havana, when they go to Havana to buy cloth and fabric for her to make the dresses and so on, there is a Jewish community there, and there they meet, other Jewish immigrants that very much want to be part of Cuba but stay apart from Cuba, right? Because they're concerned about being assimilated into Cuban culture. They want to hold on to their Jewishness, and there's a character in the city of Havana, Rivka Rubinstein, who owns a fabric shop, and she's like constantly sort of telling Esther, like warning Esther not to become too Cuban, not to end up liking Cuban music or anything like that, because she might lose her culture. And so that's kind of a concern. And I think I want to speak against that idea that you might lose your culture by taking part in a different culture, because with Esther, she knows that she has this Jewish identity, this Jewish community. It's very important to her, obviously, but at the same time, she's becoming part of a Cuban culture where Afro-Cuban culture is important, where Chinese Cuban culture is important to the community, and so she wants to be part of that new community that is embracing her and that is taking her in and that is being tolerant of her. So I think in my book, it's the fact that Esther's torn and she's being, told by the elders, her Jewish elders, like, don't get too close to these people because, we want to be sure that you remain Jewish. And she, on the other hand, as a young person, is curious, is open-minded. She doesn't feel afraid, to go to Afro-Cuban rituals, for example, that she attends, with her friend Manuela at Manuela's family's house. And there's the bata drumming. That is the way the deities are called down, the Afro-Cuban deities, the orishas are called down to earth through drumming and dancing, and she becomes a part of that. She ends up accidentally stepping into one of these ceremonies, and her friend Manuela says, dance, you have to dance, because this is a religion where you don't just stand there, you dance it. And so she has to dance, and she very much wants to belong to that community as well, and she does, and her father's kind of very concerned about how open and tolerant she is, and the way she's sharing her Jewish culture, and the way she's entering into the culture of this other community in Cuba. But then, what I realized as I was getting near the end of the book is that I had to have her father go through a kind of catharsis and transformation as well. And so at the very end, as they're about to leave the town and go move to Havana, there's an important ceremony going on for San Lázaro Babaluaye, as he's known in the Afro-Cuban pantheon, and they're invited to go there by Manuela's grandmother, and Esther kind of pauses for a moment thinking, well, her father's not going to want to go to the ceremony. But in fact, by that point, he says, yes, let's go. And he goes. And so he enters into, a different, religious community than the one that he's so familiar with. But he's a man of so much faith, of so much prayer, that it becomes significant to him to enter into this community. So while still obviously being aware that he's a very Jewish person. So I wanted to kind of show how communities can also embrace each other, and that can be healing when communities can interact with one another in this positive kind of way where everybody holds on to their diversity. No one is losing what's unique about them as a community, but they can also embrace one another and even interact with one another and enjoy each other's, ceremonies and rituals. So that was, for me, a very important part of the story. And I think it's what heals Esther, because Esther has lost the community that she had in Poland. The Jewish community there has fractured. And so she's lost that, but then she gains a new community that allows her to be who she's always been, but also to be a new person.
Thank you all for those answers. Something that I heard over and over wasn't just the power of community to heal, but also the power of community accountability, I guess I would say. And Saadia, I think that played such a huge role in the conclusion of Yusuf Azeem is not a hero. I know in your author's note at the end of the book, you described that one of your goals with the novel was to think of an alternate ending for a real life incident that happened in Texas in 2015 when a 14-year-old Amin Muhammad was arrested because he had brought a disassembled clock to show to his teachers at school. And you call out the fact that a large part of that alternative ending for Yusuf is that he has a better community support system. He has a school that does the right thing, adults that own up to their mistakes, community members and neighbors who really step forward to show Yusuf that he's not alone. And I know, as well as you've mentioned already, that a large part of your life is being an interfaith activist, which is a theme that also really heavily intertwines with some of this community accountability. And I was wondering if you hope that readers take away one big lesson from the story about building interfaith communities that can be sort of leaned upon in times of hardship to facilitate healing. What would that lesson be for people who want to start doing some of this interfaith work?
Wow, one lesson, that's hard. There are lots of lessons to be taken from community activism, and I think that overall you can kind of encapsulate all of those little things into one big lesson, I guess you could say, which is that show up, I guess, stand up for what's right and like say something. So often we're quiet because we see something happen, but we don't want to get in the middle of it. We don't want that hatred or that prejudice or that and whatever is happening that we were seeing focused on us, and we kind of justify it in terms of, well, it's our job to keep ourselves safe or our family safe, and if we get in the middle of this, but you see time and again in many different situations in Yusuf's story, as well as in the journal entries that his uncle writes, that when people kind of take a step out into public and do something, that's publicly supporting a person or a group of people that's being bullied, I guess, for want of a better word, that does make a difference, whether it's on an individual level or a community level. And you see that when, Yusuf's school and his principal decide, like you said, very differently from what happens often in real life, when they decide to apologize and to try to change their policies to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again to any child. Or when the several churches in their town get together and kind of show up to support Yusuf and his Muslim community build their mosque that some people were protesting against. Or when there's, the community, the city council meeting, and people show up in support, so that the small community isn't kind of the only one taking the brunt of people saying, well, how they don't have a right to build their place of worship in our city. It's all about showing up and taking a stand and saying something to support that person or that group of people. So, just finding a way to do that safely. You don't have to be, some heroic person who goes and stands in front of a group of, I don't know, gun-toting individuals. But there are ways to do that. You can write a letter to a newspaper. You can, there's so many ways, and a lot of those ways are in the book. So hopefully, there'll be something there for everybody to kind of look at and say, oh, the rest of it sounds a bit scary, but this one thing I can do. And hopefully that's all that it takes.
That's so fantastic. Something that the lesson I took away from the book was that sometimes words alone aren't enough and actions alone might not be enough. But when you combine using your voice with taking direct action, that's a way as an individual you can really start to communicate change. So thank you so much for reiterating that. I really appreciated it. Ruth, as you also talked about, Letters from Cuba also really deals with a narrative of interfaith backgrounds and connections and communities that come together to form these deep bonds of friendship. And having said that, as you often pointed out, there are characters like Esther's father who find this natural bonding that the kids are having to be a little bit harder to do because they're adults. So I was wondering, how do you think adults can learn from the examples of kids in their lives to build community and friendship in the process of healing?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Maggie. I think it's really true that kids often are more tolerant and open because they haven't learned all the prejudice and hatred that we're also seeing. That kids also do seem to learn prejudice and hatred very early on, unfortunately, in school and in the media and so on. So they're not, necessarily safe from that kind of, horrible stuff that goes on, in the world. But on the other hand, I think there may be, in general, more openness among kids to learning about difference and diversity. So I think, what I tried to show in the story is that, that Esther has that kind of openness. I mean, she's very aware of her identity, but she has more openness and really wants to learn about the new culture in which she finds herself in Cuba. And I think adults, not to use too much of a stereotype here, but I think adults do tend to be more set in their ways. They've already, become part of, of a certain identity, a certain community, and often I think it's hard to break out of that. They have, different kinds of commitments, perhaps, to these communities that they already belong to, and trying to belong to another community or even, dip their feet into another community seems extremely difficult. Whereas a young person like Esther, an 11, 12-year-old girl, is still kind of trying to find her way and trying to understand, what community does she belong to, or can she belong to more than one community, which is really, Esther's dilemma in the story. Can I belong to two communities, or do I have to choose one and only be part of that one? And so I think, Esther realizes, no, I can be part of two communities. And I think her father doesn't understand that point at the beginning of the story, because he's still, living within a certain, model that he's lived in for many more years, being older than Esther. And so I think it takes some time before he's willing to accept, what Esther is trying to teach him. And I think always, the kids do teach us so much, that, we can learn so much from them, from the questions that they ask, from the dilemmas that they face. And I think that, they push us to think about things, and kids push us to think about, why are we doing things a certain way? Do they have to be done that way? And I think that's what Esther is kind of doing. Like, do we have to be like so, closed within our identity in order to be Jewish? Can we be Jewish and also be open to other identities and, cultures and religions? And I think that that's something that that is a lesson, in a sense, that she teaches her father by the end of the novel, and it's Esther that brings the adults together, and the other kids, her friends Manuela and Francisco, who also bring the adults together into this interfaith, intercultural community. So I think the point for me is that we can learn a lot from kids. The kids also unfortunately absorb the prejudices of adults, but they also can offer us a fresh start to creating communities that are more loving and more inclusive.
Thank you for that. You both really outlined some good positive ways that we can take responsibility and action and build community. I have a question for Jasmine, which is less community focused. In your novel, you show us Quinn, who really takes on the responsibility of her brother's wrongdoings. And I really empathized with that. And so I wanted to know what you were mindful of when writing about Quinn's healing journey as it relates to shouldering the burden of adult responsibilities.
Yeah, that was something, thank you for that question. It's definitely something that I grappled with a lot while writing the book, because I think that Quinn feels a lot of guilt and a lot of responsibility about not speaking up about the changes that she was noticing in her brother sooner, and kind of how she had this sense that maybe something bad could happen, but didn't know how to verbalize that and couldn't have imagined really what it would be. But now that it's happened, can see it so clearly. And I think oftentimes that happens after something terrible happens. We're able to only see in retrospect all these things that really were pretty clear warning signs that we excused or we brushed under the table. And so I did really want the book to have a dialogue about that, because so often I feel like when you talk with families of the perpetrators of these crimes, they're always like, yeah, but I didn't think it would be my son, or I didn't think it would be my brother. And to have this conversation about how no one ever thinks that or expects that. But also talking about how Quinn isn't responsible for her brother, right? At the end of the day, she's her own person, and she shouldn't be held to account for something that her brother did separate from her. And I think that's a really difficult thing for her to understand, that while in an idealized world, she probably should have made different choices than she did, well, also that she's not responsible for his actions. And I'm always interested in those messy, like textured, complicated things, again, of hoping to raise discussion, of hoping to have a group of young readers talking about, and some of them may feel that Quinn is more responsible than others do. And I'm interested in that question of who is responsible when these things happen, and how responsible are all of us to our communities to raise our voices when we notice things that are unsettling in our loved ones. And so I think, though, more than anything, it's a problem in the book, and I hope that readers will think about this, that Quinn really seems to be grappling with this guilt and responsibility in a way that Quinn's parents do not. The Quinn's parents have kind of shrugged it off and tried to excuse themselves and tried to act like, again, that this was an inevitable thing, that this was an inevitable tragedy in the way that perhaps like an earthquake is. And I don't think those two things are equivalent. And again, I think the novelist's job sometimes is to set up these scenarios, right, that don't have clear answers, so that readers have to think about it and think about, what would they have done if they were in Quinn's situation? What do they think is wrong about the way Quinn's parents are behaving, or what do they think is right? And I like this idea that, again, the book doesn't answer all of these questions directly, but more is asking them, and could have readers who have various different opinions on it. But I think that, like I said, I think at the very beginning of this panel, that the book was born out of, though, the frustration that I feel that so much of our national policy has thrust the responsibility for stopping active shooter drills onto our kids, that our schools now have policies about, if you notice something, you better say something, or we're going to do this lockdown drill so that you know exactly where to go to be safe. And is that really who should be bearing the responsibility for this problem? That's what's frustrating to me, is this complete abjectation, like refusal to take any responsibility of grown-ups, of our policymakers, of our government, to try to come up with a solution that isn't just, that's make our kids feel like it's their job to stop these things from happening or to keep themselves safe in this if something terrible does happen. And so I wanted to, I guess the book kind of toys with that issue and is always asking who holds responsibility, who holds power, and who has the ability to make a change. And I think, like I keep coming back to, I think there's a multitude of answers to that. And that's kind of what I'm interested in when I'm writing books, is writing really messy, complicated questions that have the possibility for lots of different answers.
Thank you all. What I'm hearing from all of your answers is that community matters, and that's the way that we solve hard problems. And thank you all for writing these important books that are geared towards younger readers. They were really enjoyable to read, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you all for speaking with us. Maggie, do you have anything you want to add?
I just wanted to thank you all for your time and your energy and your honesty in this panel. I really learned so much more about the books, and I hope that our listeners eventually also feel like they gained a lot more insight as well. I feel like the message that I've really come away with is that personal responsibility can lead to community action, and that's really that sweet spot for making change. So thank you all so very much. And then I guess as a parting thought, I just wanted to give you all a platform to say where readers can find you, where they can buy your books. And if you want to maybe tease on something you're working on next, but you don't have to. So I guess I'll go across the screen. Jasmine, where can readers find you, and where can they buy The Shape of Thunder?
Yeah, so readers can find more about me and my work on my website, jasminewarga.com. I have social media accounts like an Instagram and a Twitter account, but I'm not the person who actively runs them. So you won't get a personal response from me, but those accounts are active and are also good places to I'll have my wonderful social media person will post photos about upcoming events or things about new work that may be coming out. And I guess on that note about new work, I have a new book that will be coming out next fall that I'm very, very excited about because it's so different from any novel that I've ever tried before. I definitely think of it as my pandemic book in the way that, I don't know if my other panelists agree, but I feel like the pandemic really shook up my imagination in a way because it put us in a situation, none of us had ever been in before. And so the book is narrated by a Mars rover. So it is the story of this Mars rover's creation and the NASA JPL lab all the way to his journey to Mars. And it's a book kind of about exploration and curiosity and imagination, but it's also about isolation and what does it mean to leave everything you've ever known? What does it mean to be alone? So I think you can, if you look at it, you could tell the time period in which I wrote it. But like I said, I'm really excited about it. I kind of pitch it as One and Only Ivan, but with robots type vibe to it. So, and that will be out next fall. I don't have an exact pub date, but sometime basically a year from now. So.
That sounds so cool. I will definitely be picking that up when it's out. Thank you, Jasmine. Ruth, where can readers find you, and maybe what are you working on next?
Thank you. Well, they can find me at my website, Ruth Behar. That's always an easy place. And I do have Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and I do post things myself as best I can. So I do post news about events and things like that on those social media sites. And so I'm very excited. I have a picture book coming out on January 25th next year. So it'll be my first picture book. I adore picture books. I think they're so beautiful. And there's also, I did finish writing it before this happened, but now that it's happened, I'm very glad that a picture book is coming because I just became a grandmother. So I'm looking forward to sharing this book with my granddaughter when it comes out next year in January. It's It's called Tia Fortuna's New Home. And the story actually takes place in Miami. And it's inspired by a favorite aunt of mine, but it's also very, very fictional, about an elderly woman who has to give up her little cottage by the beach because the building is going to be torn down to create a luxury hotel. And so she's spending her last day at this cottage on the beach, and her little niece, Estrella, is helping her say goodbye to her old home and going to help her move to her new home. So that's Tia Fortuna's New Home, and I'm very excited. It's coming out simultaneously in English and Spanish. So very, very thrilled about that. And the artist is Devin Holtzworth, who made some really beautiful, beautiful, beautiful illustrations for this book. So it's been really fun to collaborate on a book with an artist. I love the visual arts, and this was just a really fun project, though I have to say it was not easy to write a picture book. I thought it would be much easier than writing a middle grade novel, but it was much harder because you have to be so precise. It's like trying to write the perfect poem, under 1,000 words. How can you tell a complete story? And so it was actually very challenging, but once I finally finished it, I was very happy with it. So very excited about that, and have actually another picture book that will be, in the works pretty soon. And then I have a middle grade novel that hopefully will come out also late next year or early the next year. And that one, I'm also experimenting with new ways of writing. And that story takes place in 4 different historical moments. And it's about 4 different young women protagonists, all of them dealing with major historical changes. And they all do connect by the end of the story. But when you're reading it, you might not necessarily know how they all connect till the end. So that's I'm having a lot of fun with that, and trying something new. And then I hope after that's done, Jasmine, I hope to write a verse novel. I really, really, really love them, and hoping I've started to dabble with that, and hoping that that after this next one is done and out, that I can then move to experiment with that format too.
Well, first of all, congratulations, Ruth. That's very exciting. And I can't wait to see your first picture book. That sounds so wonderful. Saadia, last but not least, same question. Where can readers find you? What are you working on?
Oh my gosh, I'm working on a lot of things. I don't think you want me to go through all of them. I have, I think, 8 books coming out next year, and then 11 the year after that. So just lots of books, 2 new series, and then of course the series Yasmin that's ongoing that a lot of kids know about. That one, will have more books. I also have my first nonfiction project coming, a nonfiction biography collection that I co-wrote with my mom. So you can, connect with me on social media. I love social media. I'm there all the time. I'm more than I should be at my desk writing, my next 20 books. So Twitter and Instagram is where you'll always be able to connect with me, learn about, new books coming out, and I really communicate and engage and respond to everybody who's on there connecting with me. But there's also my website, saadiafaruqi.com, that has, especially not just the books that I have coming out or already out, but educator guides and discussion guides like a lot of us authors do. So, things like Yusuf Azeem is not a hero, or any of my books. Sometimes it's just helpful to have some of that guided discussion kind of, tools and resources. So I hope that people who want to read those books and talk about them with kids in their lives take advantage of that, because it's there for that purpose.
Well, thank you all so much. I think that we should wrap up. But thank you all for talking to us. This was delightful.
Thank you
so much. It was wonderful. Thank you for your great questions.
Yeah, and I love chatting with, hearing Jasmine and Ruth as well.